It was just a wedding portrait, preserved in yellowed newspaper clippings and forgotten archive boxes. But when Dr. Robert Hayes, a criminal historian at the Newport Historical Society, examined the photograph under magnification in the spring of 2023, he discovered something that would unravel one of the most chilling deceptions of the Gilded Age. The formal wedding photograph, dated June 15, 1905, showed what appeared to be the pinnacle of American high society elegance and happiness. The image captured the marriage of Miss Charlotte Vandermir, daughter of railroad magnate William Vandermir, to Mr. Charles Whitmore, a distinguished gentleman who had recently arrived in Newport social circles with impressive credentials and impeccable manners. The bride, radiant in an elaborate white silk gown with intricate embroidery and a cathedral-length veil, gazed adoringly at her new husband. Her dress featured hundreds of seed pearls hand-sewn into delicate floral patterns, with layers of Belgian lace cascading from her shoulders. Her dark hair was arranged in the fashionable Gibson girl style, crowned with orange blossoms and a diamond tiara that had belonged to her grandmother. The groom appeared in every respect a successful businessman and devoted husband, impeccably dressed in a morning coat and striped trousers, his dark hair perfectly styled with pomade. His posture was erect and confident, his expression one of satisfied contentment. A gold watch chain draped across his vest, suggesting prosperity and refined taste. Behind them, the ornate interior of the Vandermeer seaside mansion spoke of tremendous wealth and social position. The wedding itself had been extensively covered by society newspapers, with journalists describing it as one of the most magnificent celebrations of a 1905 social season. The New York Times devoted an entire column to the event, detailing every aspect from the floral arrangements to the guest list. 300 guests attended the ceremony and reception held in elaborate gardens overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. The guest list included senators, industrial magnates, prominent bankers, and several members of European nobility who happened to be visiting America that summer. The ceremony had taken place in the mansion's grand ballroom, which had been transformed into a floral paradise. Thousands of white roses and lilies, imported specially from Europe at considerable expense, created cascading displays along the walls and columns. Crystal chandeliers had been polished until they sparkled like diamonds, and every surface gleamed with careful attention. The Vandermeer family had spared no expense to ensure their only daughter's wedding would be remembered as the social event of the year. A 40-piece string orchestra, brought in from Boston, played during both the ceremony and reception. Guests dined on elaborate multi-course meals prepared by 3 chefs imported from New York's finest restaurants. The menu included oysters, lobster bisque, roasted pheasant, and a towering wedding cake decorated with spun sugar flowers. Champagne flowed freely, and guests danced late into the evening on the mansion's marble terrace. The bride's gown alone had cost more than most American families earned in several years, a staggering sum that reflected both the Vandermeer wealth and their determination to showcase their daughter's elevated status. Charlotte's trousseau, prepared over 6 months, included dozens of gowns, traveling suits, and accessories appropriate for her new position as Mrs. Charles Whitmore. Contemporary accounts described Charlotte as luminous with happiness, her face glowing as she exchanged vows with her handsome groom. One society columnist wrote that she had never seen a bride more radiantly content, and that Charlotte's joy was evident in her every gesture and glance. Society columnists praised the match enthusiastically, noting how perfectly suited the couple appeared, how Whitmore's sophisticated European background complemented the Vandermeer family's American industrial success. The newspaper coverage painted Charles Whitmore as an ideal match, a gentleman of breeding, education, and prospects. His credentials seemed impeccable. Educated at Cambridge University, son of a successful British merchant family, with business interests in international shipping and trade. He spoke knowledgeably about European affairs, displayed refined manners, and moved through Newport society with the ease of someone born privileged. William Vandermeer had publicly expressed his delight at his daughter's choice, telling reporters that Whitmore reminded him of the finest European gentleman he had encountered during his business travels. Charlotte's mother, Margaret, had praised her new son-in-law's attentiveness and devotion to her daughter. But when Dr. Hayes examined a photograph under magnification that spring afternoon in 2023, something caught his attention that transformed this image of matrimonial bliss into something far more sinister. The groom's left hand, which rested on the bride's waist in what appeared to be a protective, affectionate gesture, revealed an almost imperceptible detail that changed everything. His ring finger bore no wedding band. In an era when such omissions were noticed and remarked upon, when every detail of high society weddings was scrutinized and documented in newspaper columns, this absence was striking and unusual. Gentlemen of Whitmore's supposed class would never appear in their wedding portrait without the symbol of their new marital status. But that wasn't what stopped Dr. Hayes cold. Under magnification, he could see faint scarring across the groom's knuckles, the kind of marks that came from repeated impact, from fists meeting resistance again and again. The scarring was old, well-healed, suggesting a pattern of violence that extended back years. These weren't the hands of a refined British gentleman who spent his days managing business correspondence and attending social functions. These were the hands of someone who had used them as weapons. More disturbing still, the positioning of his hand on Charlotte's waist showed his fingers pressed into the fabric of her gown with visible tension, indenting the silk in a way that suggested not affection but control. The pressure was so pronounced that even in the static image, you could see how the delicate silk bunched unnaturally beneath his grip. His thumb, positioned at her ribcage, pressed inward with unmistakable force. The other fingers curved around her waist in a manner that looked painful even through layers of fabric and corsetry. This wasn't the gentle touch of a groom posing for a formal portrait. This was a grip of someone asserting ownership, establishing dominance, sending a message that would be invisible to everyone except those who knew to look for it. Dr. Hayes had seen similar positioning in photographs of known domestic abusers from the early 20th century, images captured by police or social workers documenting patterns of violence. Dr. Hayes had spent 15 years studying criminal photography and documentation from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. He had examined countless images of criminals' victims and crime scenes, learning to read the subtle visual language of violence and control. He had studied posture, facial expressions, body language, all the unconscious signals that photographs preserved. He recognized the signs. This wasn't the gentle touch of a loving husband. This was the grip of someone accustomed to exerting physical dominance, someone who couldn't even maintain the facade for the few seconds required to capture a wedding portrait. He sat back in his chair, the photograph still illuminated on his desk under the harsh examination light, and felt a cold certainty settle over him. Something terrible had happened to Charlotte Vandermir Whitmore, and the evidence had been hiding in plain sight for over a century, captured in this single wedding portrait that everyone had assumed documented nothing but joy and celebration. The truth had been there all along, waiting for someone to look closely enough to see it. The formal wedding photograph, dated June 15, 1905, showed what appeared to be the pinnacle of American high society elegance and happiness. The image captured the marriage of Miss Charlotte Vandermir, daughter of railroad magnate William Vandermir, to Mr. Charles Whitmore, a distinguished gentleman who had recently arrived in Newport social circles with impressive credentials and impeccable manners. The bride, radiant in an elaborate white silk gown with intricate embroidery and a cathedral-length veil, gazed adoringly at her new husband. The groom appeared in every respect a successful businessman and devoted husband, impeccably dressed in a morning coat and striped trousers, his dark hair perfectly styled. Behind them, the ornate interior of the Vandermeer seaside mansion spoke of tremendous wealth and social position. The wedding itself had been extensively covered by society newspapers, with journalists describing it as one of the most magnificent celebrations of the 1905 social season. 300 guests attended the ceremony and reception held in elaborate gardens overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. The guest list included senators, industrial magnates, and several members of European nobility who happened to be visiting America that summer. The ceremony had taken place in the mansion's grand ballroom, decorated with thousands of white roses and lilies imported specially from Europe. A string orchestra played during the reception, and guests dined on elaborate multi-course meals prepared by chefs brought in from New York's finest restaurants. The bride's gown alone had cost more than most American families earned in several years. Contemporary accounts described Charlotte as luminous with happiness, her face glowing as she exchanged vows with her handsome groom. Society columnists praised the match, noting how perfectly suited the couple appeared, how Whitmore's sophisticated European background complemented the Vandermeer family's American industrial success. But when Dr. Hayes examined the photograph under magnification, something caught his attention that transformed this image of matrimonial bliss into something far more sinister. The groom's left hand, which rested on the bride's waist in what appeared to be a protective, affectionate gesture, revealed an almost imperceptible detail. His ring finger bore no wedding band. In an era when such omissions were noticed and remarked upon, when every detail of high society weddings was scrutinized and documented, this absence was striking. But that wasn't what stopped Dr. Hayes cold. Under magnification, he could see faint scarring across the groom's knuckles, the kind of marks that came from repeated impact, from fists meeting resistance again and again. More disturbing still, the positioning of his hand on Charlotte's waist showed his fingers press into the fabric of her gown with visible tension, indenting the silk in a way that suggested not affection but control. The pressure was so pronounced that even in the static image, you could see how the delicate silk bunched unnaturally beneath his grip. His thumb, positioned at her ribcage, pressed inward with unmistakable force. This wasn't the gentle touch of a groom posing for a formal portrait. This was the grip of someone asserting ownership. Dr. Hayes had spent 15 years studying criminal photography and documentation from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. He had examined countless images of criminals, victims, and crime scenes. He recognized the signs. This wasn't the gentle touch of a loving husband. This was the grip of someone accustomed to exerting physical dominance. He sat back in his chair, the photograph still illuminated on his desk, and felt a cold certainty settle over him. Something terrible had happened to Charlotte Vandermir Whitmore, and the evidence had been hiding in plain sight for over a century, captured in this single wedding portrait that everyone had assumed documented nothing but joy. Dr. Hayes returned to the archive records, searching for more information about the couple. The donation box that contained the photograph had arrived from an estate sale in Providence, Rhode Island, 2 months earlier. Along with the wedding portrait were dozens of other photographs, letters, newspaper clippings, and personal documents spanning from 1903 to 1908. He spread the materials across his research table and began to piece together the story. What emerged was far darker than he had imagined. Charlotte Vandermir had been 22 years old in the summer of 1905, the only daughter of William and Margaret Vandermir. Her father had made his fortune in railroads during the expansion era, building lines across the Midwest and establishing himself among America's industrial elite. Starting with a single railway line in Ohio in 1875, William had expanded his empire through strategic acquisitions and ruthless business practices until his network stretched from Chicago to the eastern seaboard. The Vandermeer family maintained residences in New York, Newport, and Boston, moving between them according to the social season. Their New York mansion occupied an entire block on Fifth Avenue, furnished with European antiques and original artwork. The Newport cottage was actually a sprawling estate with 30 rooms, manicured gardens, and direct ocean access. The family employed dozens of servants and moved through the highest circles of American society. By all accounts, Charlotte had been educated at the finest finishing schools, first at Miss Porter's School in Connecticut, then at a prestigious academy in Switzerland. She spoke 3 languages fluently, French, German, and Italian. She showed considerable talent as a pianist and had performed at several private concerts for society audiences. Her teachers described her as intelligent, sensitive, and unusually thoughtful for someone of her privileged background. She had made her society debut 2 years earlier, in 1903, an elaborate ball held at the family's Fifth Avenue mansion. 500 guests had attended, and Charlotte had worn a white silk gown embroidered with silver thread. The event had been covered extensively in society pages, with newspapers describing the young Miss Vandermeer as graceful, accomplished, and possessing both beauty and refinement. Following her debut, Charlotte had been courted by several eligible young men from established families. The archive contained calling cards and letters from suitors with surnames like Astor, Rhinelander, and Van Rensselaer, the old New York families whose approval mattered most in elite circles. But Charlotte had seemed in no hurry to marry, apparently content with her music, her studies, and her charitable work. Charles Whitmore had appeared in Newport in March 1905, introduced to society by a prominent Boston banker named Edward Thornton, who vouched enthusiastically for his character and background. Whitmore claimed to be the son of a successful British merchant family based in London, educated at Cambridge University, with significant business interests in international shipping and trade. He was 30 years old, handsome in a dark, intense way, and showed all the refinements expected of a gentleman. He spoke with a cultured British accent, displayed extensive knowledge of European culture and politics, and moved through social situations with practiced ease. He dressed impeccably, always in the latest London fashions, and carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to privilege. Within weeks of his arrival, he had secured invitations to most exclusive social events and was being discussed as one of the season's most eligible bachelors. The courtship had been rapid and intense. Whitmore focused his attention on Charlotte almost immediately after meeting her at a dinner party in early April. He sent elaborate flower arrangements to the Vandermir residence daily, accompanied by notes written in elegant script. He attended every social event where Charlotte would be present, positioning himself near her, engaging her in conversation, making his interest unmistakable. Charlotte's friends later told investigators that she had been flattered but somewhat overwhelmed by the attention. Whitmore was sophisticated, worldly, different from the young American men who had courted her previously. He spoke to her about literature, art, and philosophy, treating her as an intellectual equal in a way that was unusual for the era. He was attentive without being suffocating, or so it seemed at first. Within 3 months, Whitmore had proposed, presenting Charlotte with a family ring he claimed had belonged to his grandmother, a large sapphire surrounded by diamonds. Charlotte had accepted, caught up in what she believed was a romantic love story worthy of the novels she enjoyed reading. Her parents, impressed by Whitmore's credentials and the banker Thornton's enthusiastic endorsement, approved the match while conducting any independent investigation into his background. Wedding preparations began immediately for a June ceremony. Margaret Vandermeer threw herself into planning what she was determined would be Newport's most spectacular wedding. No expense was spared, no detail overlooked. The family's social position demanded a display of wealth and taste that would be remembered for years. But as Dr. Hayes examined the newspaper clippings more carefully, he noticed something odd that struck him as significant. While the engagement announcement and wedding coverage appeared in all major society pages, with extensive details about the ceremony and reception, there were no mentions of Whitmore prior to March 1905. For someone supposedly from a prominent family with significant business interests, this absence was highly unusual. Society pages typically documented every detail of elite lives, business trips, social engagements, family connections, travel itineraries. Yet Charles Whitmore appeared in a historical record fully formed in March 1905, with no prior history, no mentions in London society pages, no business dealings documented in trade publications. It was as if he had materialized from nothing. Dr. Hayes contacted the Newport Historical Society's genealogy specialist, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, who agreed to help investigate Whitmore's background. Sarah had spent 20 years tracing family lineages and had access to extensive databases of British and American records. What they discovered over the following weeks was chilling. There was no Whitmore family matching Charles's description in British records. No merchant family of that name operated in London during the relevant period. No Charles Whitmore had attended Cambridge University between 1892 and 1895, the years he would have been a student based on his claimed age. No shipping business registered under the Whitmore name existed in British commercial records. The sapphire engagement ring could have been purchased from any jeweler. Every detail of Charles Whitmore's supposed background was a fabrication. He had constructed an entirely fictional identity, one designed specifically to appeal to wealthy American families seeking European sophistication for their daughters. And he had done it so skillfully that no one had questioned it. But Dr. Mitchell found something else, buried in police records from Chicago. A report dated November 1904 described a confidence man named Charles Werner, who had been arrested for defrauding a wealthy widow named Mrs. Helen Cartwright. Werner had convinced the widow to invest in a fictitious shipping venture, extracting nearly $50,000 before she discovered the fraud. The charges had been dropped when Mrs. Cartwright suddenly refused to testify and left Chicago abruptly, reportedly moving to California to live with relatives. The physical description in the police report matched perfectly Tall, approximately 6 feet, dark-haired, well-built, approximately 30 years old, with notable scarring on both hands. The report noted that Werner was exceptionally charming and persuasive and capable of assuming various accents and personas with remarkable skill. Dr. Hayes obtained a photograph from the Chicago police file through a contact at the city's historical archives. When it arrived, he placed it beside the wedding portrait. There was no doubt Charles Werner and Charles Whitmore were the same man. The same intense gaze, the same firm jawline, the same confident posture. Only the clothes and setting were different. The picture grew darker still as Dr. Hayes continued his investigation. He found letters in the donation box, correspondence between Charlotte and her cousin Emily Prescott, who lived in Boston. The letters were dated from July through November 1905, covering Charlotte's first 6 months of marriage. The letters were carefully worded, maintaining the proper tone expected of high society correspondence. Charlotte would never have explicitly described anything improper or distressing, as such letters might be read by servants or family members. But reading between the lines, understanding the coded language women of that era used to communicate difficulties, Dr. Hayes recognized a growing nightmare unfolding. In the first letter, dated July 12, 1905, just 3 weeks after the wedding, Charlotte wrote about adjusting to married life. She mentioned that Charles had particular ways of doing things, and that she was learning to accommodate his preferences. She described how he insisted on reviewing her daily schedule each morning, determining which social calls she would make and which invitations she would accept. She wrote that Charles believed a husband should guide his wife's activities, and that this was quite proper and shows his devotion to my well-being. But even in those early weeks, there were hints of something wrong. Charlotte mentioned that Charles preferred she not visit her parents without his accompaniment, as he felt a wife's first loyalty must be to her husband's household. She had declined several invitations from her mother for this reason. By August, the tone had shifted. Charlotte wrote that Charles had taken control of her personal finances, including the substantial trust fund her father had settled on her at her marriage. She explained it as proper for a husband to manage such matters, but there was a defensive quality to her words, as if she were trying to convince herself as much as Emily. She mentioned that Charles had made several investments with her funds and assured her they would yield excellent returns. She also wrote, almost casually, that Charles did not like her spending time at the piano, as the music disturbed his concentration when he was working on business correspondence. Charlotte had been a passionate pianist, and the enforced silence must have been difficult. But she wrote that a wife must make sacrifices for her husband's comfort. The September letter marked a clear change. Charlotte apologized for canceling a planned visit to Emily in Boston, saying she had taken a fall on the stairs and needed to recover quietly at home. She assured Emily it was nothing serious, just some bruising that made travel uncomfortable. She wrote that she had been clumsy and that Charles had been very concerned and attentive during her recovery. Dr. Hayes had seen enough domestic violence cases to recognize the pattern. The isolated fall, the bruising, the canceled plans, the assurances that everything was fine. These were classic signs. Charlotte's words were carefully chosen to deflect concern, but the subtext was clear. By late September, Charlotte's letters had become shorter and less frequent. She wrote that Charles kept irregular hours, and that she often didn't know when he would be home. She mentioned that their servants had begun leaving, and that finding replacements was difficult. She didn't explain why the servants were leaving, but Dr. Hayes could guess. Household staff often recognized abuse before family members did, and they typically refused to remain in such situations. The October letter was the most revealing and the most heartbreaking. Charlotte's careful composure finally cracked. She wrote that she had discovered Charles had no business interests whatsoever, that he spent his days gambling at private clubs and drinking at establishments she wouldn't name. He had already gone through a substantial portion of her dowry, more than $30,000 lost to cards and bad investments. When Charlotte had confronted him about the missing funds, demanding an accounting, Charles had become terribly angry. She didn't describe what happened next in detail, but she wrote that she would be staying indoors until certain marks healed, and that she hoped Emily would understand and not worry over much. She mentioned that her maid had suggested calling a doctor, But Charlotte had refused, not wanting it to create a scandal or embarrass the family. She wrote one devastating line: "I fear I have made a terrible mistake, but there is no remedy for it now. A woman cannot simply unmake a marriage because she finds it difficult." The November letter was brief and written in a shaky hand, quite different from Charlotte's usually elegant script. She told Emily she was going to ask her father for help, that she couldn't continue living this way, that she was frightened of what Charles might do. She had discovered he had forged her signature on documents transferring additional funds from her trust, and when she confronted him, he had told her that if she spoke to anyone about their private affairs, she would regret it deeply. Charlotte wrote that she planned to visit her parents' New York residence the following week, during a time when Charles would be away on what he claimed was a business trip to Boston. She would tell her father everything and ask for his protection. She ended the letter with, "Pray for me, Emily. I believe I am in more danger than I fully understood until now." There were no more letters. Charlotte never made that trip to New York. Dr. Hayes searched desperately through the remaining documents for more information about what happened next. He found the answer in a tragic newspaper article from the Newport Daily News, dated December 3rd, 1905. The headline read, "Tragic Death of Mrs. Charles Whitmore." Charlotte Vandermir Whitmore had died on November 28, 1905, at her Newport residence. The cause of death was listed as accidental fall downstairs. She was 22 years old. She had been married for 5 months and 13 days. The brief article mentioned that Mrs. Whitmore had suffered the fatal fall while her husband was away on business in Boston. Charles Whitmore had returned to find his wife's body at the bottom of the main staircase and had immediately summoned doctors and police. The attending physician had determined that she had died from a broken neck, consistent with fall from height. No inquest was held. The death was ruled accidental. The newspaper quoted Whitmore as being devastated beyond measure by the loss of his beloved wife. He had told reporters that Charlotte had been in low spirits recently, struggling with nerves, and that he blamed himself for not recognizing the severity of her condition. He suggested she might have been dizzy or faint when she fell. But Dr. Hayes found one more document that suggested a very different story. A letter from Charlotte's mother Margaret to Emily Prescott, dated 2 weeks after the funeral, tucked in the back of the donation box. Margaret's grief and rage bled through every word. She wrote that when they had prepared Charlotte's body for burial, they had found extensive bruising on her arms, ribs, and back. The bruises were in various stages of healing, indicating they had been inflicted over a period of weeks. There were marks on Charlotte's neck, faint but visible, suggesting someone had grabbed her throat. The pattern suggested someone had grabbed her violently, struck her repeatedly, subjected her to sustained physical abuse. The fatal injuries could have come from a fall down the stairs. But Margaret wrote that the other marks told a different story. She believed Charles had killed her daughter, whether by pushing her down the stairs or through violence that led to the fall. She wrote that Charlotte's maid had finally come forward after the death, admitting she had heard shouting and crashing sounds on the night Charlotte died, but had been too frightened to intervene. Margaret had demanded a full investigation, threatening to use every ounce of the Vandermeer influence to see justice done. But Charles Whitmore had powerful allies, connections he had cultivated carefully during his time in Newport. More importantly, the banker Edward Thornton, who had introduced and vouched for Whitmore, had died unexpectedly in a carriage accident just 2 weeks after Charlotte's wedding, taking any knowledge of Whitmore's true identity with him. Whitmore's movements on the night of Charlotte's death couldn't be precisely established. He claimed to have been in Boston, staying at the Parker House Hotel, but records showed he had checked out early that afternoon. He could have returned to Newport by evening train, murdered his wife, and then discovered her body the next morning. But without witnesses or definitive proof, no charges could be filed. Victorian society was deeply uncomfortable with such scandals. Wealthy families protected their reputations above all else. The Vandermeers were devastated by their daughter's death, but they were also conscious of the social implications of a murder accusation that might not result in conviction. A sensational trial would expose Charlotte's suffering to public scrutiny, turn her tragedy into entertainment for newspaper readers, potentially damage the family's standing in society. Authorities were reluctant to pursue murder charges against a gentleman of apparent good standing, especially when the victim's own family might be unwilling to endure the spectacle of a trial. The police investigation was perfunctory. The coroner's report was brief and conclusive: accidental death. The case was closed. What Dr. Hayes discovered next was perhaps the most disturbing detail of all. Under the laws of the time, Charles Whitmore had inherited Charlotte's personal fortune upon her death. A husband became the legal owner of his wife's property, and in the absence of a will specifying otherwise, he inherited everything when she died. Charlotte's dowry, her trust fund, her personal possessions, all became his. Estimates suggested he had gained over $200,000, an enormous sum in 1905. Whitmore had left Newport in January 1906, expressing profound grief over his wife's tragic death to anyone who would listen. He told acquaintances he couldn't bear to remain in the place where they had been so happy together, where every room held memories of his beloved Charlotte. He sold the Newport house, collected Charlotte's remaining assets, and disappeared from high society. Dr. Hayes traced him through subsequent years, finding evidence of a pattern that was chillingly clear. A man matching Whitmore's description appeared in Philadelphia in 1907, calling himself Charles Winston, courting a wealthy young widow named Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell. That engagement ended abruptly when the woman's father, a banker, discovered inconsistencies in Winston's background and threatened to expose him. Winston disappeared before he could be confronted. In 1909, a confidence man calling himself Christopher Weston was arrested in San Francisco for attempting to defraud an heiress. The physical description matched, including the scarred hands, but Weston posted bail and vanished before trial. The trail went cold after 1910. Whitmore, or whatever his real name was, had vanished into history. He had likely changed tactics, become more careful, or perhaps finally faced consequences in some jurisdiction whose records hadn't survived. Dr. Hayes organized an exhibition at the Newport Historical Society in September 2023, telling Charlotte's story through photographs, letters, and careful historical analysis. The wedding photograph was displayed prominently, with detailed explanatory text about what that groom's hand revealed: the scarred knuckles, the possessive grip, the missing wedding band, all warning signs that had gone unrecognized. Charlotte's descendant, her cousin Emily's granddaughter Patricia Morrison, attended the exhibition opening. She was 78 years old and had grown up hearing whispered family stories about poor Charlotte, who had died so young, so tragically. "We always knew something was wrong," Patricia told Dr. Hayes quietly, standing before the wedding portrait with tears streaming down her face. But in those days, families didn't talk about such things openly. My grandmother lived with the guilt of not doing more, of not recognizing the danger in Charlotte's letters until it was too late. She kept those letters her entire life, hidden away in a trunk, as if preserving them somehow honored Charlotte's memory or bore witness to what had happened. She wanted someone someday to understand. The exhibition included resources about domestic violence, historical context about women's legal rights in 1905, and information about modern support services. Dr. Hayes wanted Charlotte's story to serve a purpose beyond historical documentation, to educate, to warn, to help. Sometimes, he reflected, looking at that wedding photograph displayed under gallery lights, the darkest secrets hide in plain sight. That hand on Charlotte's waist, which guests at the wedding probably saw as affectionate and protective, had been a warning visible to anyone who knew how to read it. The scarred knuckles, the possessive grip, the missing wedding band, all signs of what was to come. Charlotte Vandermir Whitmore died over a century ago, but her story remains tragically relevant. The warning signs of controlling behavior, isolation from family, financial manipulation, unexplained injuries, these patterns transcend time and social class. They appear in every era, in every community, hidden behind closed doors and careful smiles. The wedding photograph that once represented joy and promise now serves as a reminder and a warning. Sometimes you need to look more closely. Sometimes a hand reveals more than a face ever could. And sometimes the most elegant portrait conceals the darkest truth.